So I'm really excited to be giving sort of the state of NgRx at this year's ng-conf. But first, let me introduce myself. My name is Mike Ryan. You can follow me on Twitter and GitHub at MikeRyanDev. I'm a software architect at Synapse, where I'm working on making North American manufacturing more sustainable. I'm also a Google developer expert in Angular web technologies, and I am one of the co-creators of NgRx. I want to talk about NgRx for a minute, and what I want to do is I want to start off by reintroducing NgRx to all of you, because if you get a little bit of history of what NgRx is, it might help you make sense of where NgRx is going. So NgRx was founded by, at the time, Angular team member Rob Wormald, and the mission was to build out a reactivity layer for Angular. That's where the name comes from, Angular plus RxJS, NgRx. The first library that we created was the one that made us famous, and that was Store. At this point in history, Store was really just a reactive implementation of Redux. There's only the one library, and it was built to be completely compatible with Redux from React land, but built with observables underneath the hood. Library number 2 was the router. If you saw Brandon Roberts talk yesterday about reactive routing, you're already a little familiar with the history of this project, so I won't go into it too much. But the goal was to create a routing API that was ergonomic to use in comparison to the Angular router at the time, but was also fully reactive, embraced observables underneath the hood. And the third library that we had way back in the day was the one that you are least likely to have actually heard of at this point. That was NgRx. It was a reactive library that wrapped the IndexedDB API available in browsers. So you can kind of think of it being like super-powered local storage. So what happened to these libraries? I think for many of you, you're going to say, well, I only knew about NgRx State management, so I didn't know it did all these things at the time. Well, the router grew up. The router became the Angular router. At the same time, Store really started to pick up in popularity. Now, I like to say that Store was really, really popular because it was borrowing so many great ideas from other languages and ecosystems. But I also kind of need to admit that it was really, really getting popular because it was the only state management library for Angular for a long, long time. So we had to really focus our resources on the Store and the router to help grow them and make them successful. And we had to let DB kind of fade in the background, eventually deprecate. Back then, the NgRx team was much smaller, much scrappier, and we had to be a lot more selective with what resources we had. So we let DB go into the background, router left the org, and that really just left us with Store. And it stayed this way for nearly 3 years. So I'm not terribly surprised that when someone says NgRx, they think about our state management solution first. But over the past year, we've begun to stretch back into our original mission, and we're trying to explore other ways to make the Angular ecosystem more reactive. So before I get into all the new goodness that we're bringing to you, I kind of want to look back at 2019 by the numbers and see how the project's doing. Based on our stats for NgRx.io, over 350,000 developers are using some library within the NgRx ecosystem. Altogether, developers have downloaded NgRx Store, just Store, over 12 million times in 2019 alone, and over 25 million times across the lifetime of the library. These two numbers represent 30% growth for the NgRx project. That's nearly twice as fast as the growth rate for Angular. That means more and more Angular developers are getting on board with NgRx and using some of the libraries that we published underneath the platform. We're also seeing big adoption within the enterprise space. Within Google alone, over 300 of the Angular apps rely on NgRx for their state management solution. And we couldn't have built this without the support of our community. We're proud that in 2019, over 100 contributors from the community helped make NgRx as good as it is today. And it's our contribution story that I want to talk about for just a second, because we couldn't have pulled off these amazing numbers without a little help from a few of our friends. So first off, I just want to highlight the team that builds NgRx. It can be sometimes a little fun to see the faces behind the project. And in particular, I want to highlight these 4 folks. Because in the past year, we've added Alex, John, Ward, and Wes to the NgRx team. Alex is a software engineer at Firebase and Google, and he brings a lot of great architectural mindset to the project. He's really helped shape the technical direction of NgRx since joining the team. He's actually the maintainer of NgRx within Google, so he helps support NgRx for those 300 plus applications I just mentioned, and he brings all that perspective back to NgRx to help us succeed at an enormous scale. John and Ward brought us NGRX Data, and I'm excited to share a few slides about that project in just a minute. And then lastly, Wes, he's a software engineer at Narwhal. Wes creates a lot of great content for NGRX and spends his time helping developers be successful with the platform. And what I like about this team is the vibrancy of ways in which these members have gotten onto the team. It shows that there is a path for you to get involved with a project if you're excited about trying to help us out. Whether it's being a great developer advocate for NGRX by creating blog posts, giving talks, and helping developers at meetups, or you're contributing architectural guidance, or you're actually writing code, there's a path to get involved with this project and be a member of our team. And so many of you have contributed code. Here are just a few of the top contributors to NGRX within the past year. Each of these faces here have helped deliver NGRX over the past year, and we couldn't be more proud of how many people we get involved with the project. So with that in mind, I think 2020 is going to be the year of NGRX getting back to its roots. We're going to start embracing reactivity in more ways than just state management. So let's take a look. What I want to do is I want to introduce to you NGRX in 3 categories. How is NGRX tackling state management? How is NGRX dealing with reactive data? And how is NGRX pushing observables into the view layer? So first, NgRx State. NgRx State is focused on providing enterprise-grade state management and side effect isolation for reactive Angular applications. It's comprised of 5 libraries: store, effects, entity, router, store, and the store dev tools. And we're really excited that we released version 9 last month, bringing full support for Angular Ivy into our state management solution. So since the last ng-conf, what's new? What have we changed within these state management libraries? Well, I think the thing that I'm most excited about are the new creator functions that improve type safety and reduce the amount of code you have to author to be successful within NgRx State. Let's take a look at a few of these new creator functions and see how they reduce code. So before, in NgRx, you'd have to write a lot of code just to get started with actions. This was so disappointing to me, because actions really are the fuel of the NgRx ship. They're critical to getting an NgRx State application to be successful. And if we were asking developers to write a ton of code just for the most critical part, then developers are immediately going to be turned off by our solution. With the new creator functions, the amount of code you have to author to write actions is far reduced. Now you can focus on declaring exactly what your actions are and avoid a lot of the ceremony we had to together last previous version to get type safety in your applications. We brought the same code reductions to reducers. So beforehand, you had to have a lot of ceremony during types. You had to use these big switch statements to become hard to maintain over time. And it was overall a lot of code with a lot of ways in which developers could hurt themselves here. So the new creator functions, so much of that code's gone. We can take care of that for you. Again, letting you focus on the business logic of your NgRx application. When it comes to effects, not much has changed here. We've introduced a creator function, and it's not going to reduce a lot of code here, but we did use this as an opportunity to make the API more consistent with the rest of NgRx State, and also to improve type safety. For example, here in this example effect, you might notice that there's a bit of a bug on this line where I did not map the result of one of my observable calls back into an action. In the previous format and the previous APIs, we couldn't detect this error for you until runtime. But with the new create effect helper, we can raise a type error way earlier for you and help you get this code fixed. So if you've avoided NgRx State due to code volume, I'd highly suggest taking another look. The team's done a lot of great work in reducing how much code you have to write to be successful with NgRx State. Speaking of success, we've also introduced this idea of strict runtime checks. And these strict runtime checks are really there to help developers adhere to the architectural constraints that NgRx relies on to make your applications fast and easy to debug. What do these look like? Well, there are a few runtime checks that are now enabled for you when you start using NgRx State. The first is immutability checks. NgRx wants to make sure that you are not mutating state or actions when you're implementing the architecture. This is so that you can leverage things like the on-change or the on-push change detection strategy performance within your application. We also have checks now to verify that your state is serializable. So serializability here means that we can run json.stringify on it and then json.parse on it again and get back the same value that we originally serialized. And this is important so that we can show you your application state and things like the Redux dev tools help you get insight into how your application is running. And lastly, we have runtime checks now for change detection. So developers sometimes get caught up with Zone.js. They might accidentally dispatch an action in a context that's not being watched by Zone.js, leading to them to be frustrated when they've dispatched an action, they've reduced it, but their UI is just not updated. So now NgRx State will warn you if you dispatch an action and you aren't in Zone.js. You can configure these in your root application module. So you can opt into or opt out of any of these strict runtime checks. And again, they're just there to help you be successful with the architecture. So that's a brief update on NgRx State. Now let's turn our attention to NgRx Data. NgRx Data is focused on abstracting the data needs of your view layer away from the mechanics of actually retrieving that data. Today, there's only one library in the data family, and that is NgRx Data. And we're really excited to bring NgRx Data into the family. As I mentioned at the top, this is a library created by John Papa and Ward Bell, and for a while it existed independently of the platform. Since then, we've brought NgRx Data into our monorepo. We now publish it underneath the NgRx name. We give it all the love and attention that we give to all of our other NgRx libraries. And the goal of this library is to really separate what data the client needs from how you retrieve it. Let's take a look at a very bare bones component to get an idea of what I mean here. This is a component that's going to consume a list of authors. We can tell it consumes a list of authors because it declares it as part of the data that will be available in the template. So this is the data that this component needs. It needs a list of authors. And in the constructor, we can see that we're wiring this up using a call to some API. This is the mechanism of how we actually get that data. Now with NgRx State, we can actually decouple these two. We can have components just consume data and not have to rely on the mechanics of getting that data into our application. So with NgRx State, the way you do this is first you declare some actions. You would have an action for entering maybe the author's page, and then an action for getting all the authors successfully with your author's API. Then in your authors component, you would select out the list of authors from the store, and you would say, hey, someone's entered the author's page, relying on what's called an effect to step in, listen for that interaction, and actually make that API call for you. So this strategy allows you to decouple how you retrieve data from the way you're consuming data. But that was kind of a lot of code. And so what we've found is that NgRx State may not scale well for really data-driven applications that maybe have 50+ entities. It's simply too much code to have to write if you're dealing with a really broad domain. So NgRx Data steps in and it offers an alternative. It too abstracts away the mechanics of how data is fetched, but it does it in a much different fashion. So if we were to rebuild that same application using NgRx Data, we'd start by setting up what's called an entity collection service. So here I've built an entity collection service for all of my authors in my application. You can see that I'm extending a base class, and then in my constructor, I'm giving it just enough config so that we can use all the defaults within NgRx Data. And what's really cool about this is because we're relying on those defaults within NgRx Data, this is going to scaffold out in the background all the methods and services we need to start interacting with our API. So from here, we can take this entity collection service and we can inject it into our authors component. We can read an observable of those entities right off of the service, and that entity collection service will expose a getAll method for us that already knows how to speak to our API. And that's it. That's all the code I have to write. And what's really great about this is that it's completely built on top of NgRx State. So it's reactive underneath the hood, it's performant, it's dealing with immutable data structures. But you don't need to use NgRx State to make use of NgRx Data. They play great together, so if you want to leverage the benefits of both NgRx Data and NgRx State within your application, you can. But if you just want to use NgRx Data with some other kind of state management solution, that's totally fine too. So now that we've looked at NgRx Data, let's talk about the newest part of the NgRx family, and that's NgRx View. So View right now has what I'd say 2 libraries in it, though I should mention that these are not libraries that have actually been published yet. The first is NgRx Component. If you've not seen my talk at Angular Connect about rethinking reactivity with Ivy, I would strongly recommend it. It gives a really detailed introduction into NgRx Component and what we're trying to accomplish with this library. And then yesterday, Brandon Roberts gave a talk about reactive routing and how we might rethink parts of that too in the Ivy landscape. I'd recommend going back and watching his talk to get up to date on how that library works. But for now, I want to give you an update on Component. Where is it at, and where has it come in the past 6 months? Well, I should warn you that we're really at the bleeding edge of NgRx. So you can use NgRx Component, but it's not published NPM. We're already publishing nightlies of it, so you can consume those nightlies. We have some documentation published on ngrx.io if you want to start learning it. And I know that there have been a few Twitch streamers like Mike Hardington that have been going through using this library if you want to start digging into some code samples that are working today. With NgRx Component, we're trying to rethink how change detection works for Angular applications. So if you're not familiar with what change detection is, it is an element of the Angular framework in which Angular is going to figure out what data or state in your app has changed, and then make a determination if there was changes to that data on how to update the UI. In an Angular app, Zone.js is the default mechanism Angular uses to run change detection. Zone.js monkey patches all of the ways and async APIs that are available in the browser. So that when your Angular app communicates with one of those async APIs, Angular says, hey, I know that they've reached out, maybe made a network request, or maybe they've opened up a WebSocket connection. We should check to see if we need to run change detection. But we found that at scale, there are a few flaws with this approach. First is that Zone.js isn't going to have patched 100% of the browser APIs. So as new and experimental APIs are available to us as web developers to use, Zone.js may not be up to date enough to have actually patched those new APIs. Additionally, if libraries are using native async await within the browser, Zone.js is going to have a hard time actually patching and understanding when those libraries have done something interesting. Finally, if you're using a library that has some kind of scheduling built in, like RxJS, it can be easy to accidentally escape zones and start to use async APIs that Angular is not aware that you're going to call. So what we wanted to do is we want to say, hey, could we use observables as our mechanism for determining when to run change detection? So today, NgRx Component has 2 APIs. Let's take a look at them. The first API tries to address the async pipe. The async pipe in Angular is a mechanism of allowing you to use observable values directly in the template. But we think that there could be a few improvements to the way the async pipe works. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a drop-in replacement from the NgRx component package called NgRx push. Like I said, NgRx push is a drop-in replacement for the async pipe. It's going to do the same thing. It's going to let you use values that are wrapped up in an observable. But it's going to differ in that the push pipe, unlike the async pipe, will actually schedule change detection for you when you push new values through it. What this means is that if you have modeled your application state using observables and you rely on the push pipe throughout your entire Angular app, there's a chance you could be successful in using an Angular app without Zone.js altogether. Because you've modeled your app in such a way that you can inform Angular via an observable API, hey, my data has changed, and let the push pipe schedule change detection for you. Our second API tries to address a similar problem. If you've used the async pipe before, you may have run into the situation where you wanted to use a value wrapped up in an observable in multiple places through your template. It leads to some cumbersome syntax where you're repeating yourself often using the async pipe. And, well, Angular developers have been a little clever, and they've found a workaround for this. It turns out you can use ng-if to unwrap that value, and then you can start to use that value in your template. So this has a couple of gotchas. First, if the observable you're passing into ng-if happens to contain a falsy value, like false or undefined or null, that's actually going to trigger the other behavior of ng-if where it won't show this element at all, preventing you from using observables that might contain these types of values in this way. The second is that ngIf doesn't let you handle things like the completion notification or error notification that the observables might be giving off. So that's where NgRx Let comes in. It's a structural directive that works kind of like ngIf, except it's not going to show or hide content. NgRx Let exists just to help you unwrap values. You pass in an observable, and then you can declare a template variable that points to the latest value coming out of that observable. You can then use that in your template just as you'd expect. It has additional hooks for using the completion and error notifications coming off the observable that you pass in, so check out the documentation if you want to see the full capabilities of NgRx Let. What's really cool about the Let directive, just like the push pipe, is that not only is it going to help you use observable values, but it too will run change detection for you. So now through a combination of the Let directive and the push pipe, we're trying to make it as ergonomic and friendly as possible for you to use observables in your template and to hopefully unlock a developer path for you to use an alternative change detection strategy from Zone.js. This is just the beginning for NgRx Component. In order to be truly successful, we're going to have to start thinking about ways to handle things like local state for components where you maybe don't want to rely on a global state management solution like NgRx State. We'll also have some ideas on how to expand the NgRx Component API to make even more use cases easier to use if you want to do them reactive. So that's a brief update on state, data, and view. NgRx State continues to be a robust enterprise-grade state management solution for Angular applications. We're continuing to improve it by introducing new ways for you to build state management code that is hopefully smaller in code size, more type safe, and helps you implement the architecture successfully. NgRx Data is our newest collection of libraries to help you handle things like data retrieval. How do you get data from your API? It can play great with NgRx State, or you can use it on its own. And lastly, NgRx View. It's our collection of libraries that we're pushing out this year. It's going to help you use observables in your Angular templates and explore ways to do change detection without Zone.js. But beyond these three projects, we've also got a fourth one. I'm sure you all have heard about it a couple of times at the conference, but I'm going to mention it again. We're holding a conference. It's called ng-conf, and it's going to be this November, if we are able to do so. So definitely come check it out. It's completely community organized, and we'll be excited to see you there. So a few thank yous. Thank you to the team for putting together all these great releases this past year and for continuing to build out the platform. Thank you to our sponsors, Rebug, Zedware, Oasis Digital, Narwhal, Lucas Rubelkey, Deborah Carrata. Your financial support has really helped our project. And lastly, most importantly, thank you to our community. We really appreciate all the value you provide to us, whether you're creating blog posts, sharing articles, giving talks, or contributing code. You help make NgRx successful. So with that, thank you all. I hope you have a great rest of it.